I am Danny Zausner. I am the Chief Operating Officer of the USTA Billie Jean King National Tennis Center. I've been involved with the U.S. Open. This will be my 20th U.S. Open for 2020. So I've been at with the organization, with the USTA, for the past 19 years. And obviously, we've had incredible U.S. Opens over the past 19 years, and hopefully we'll host the Open this year, and it'll be slightly on the unique side.
Okay, well, take me back to your first year there. So it would have been in 2000.
2001, actually.
2001, okay. So the facilities have changed quite a bit since then, and a lot has happened. So what was going on? We'll start with the growth. What is the mindset of we need to grow this experience, which is phenomenal and was back then, to something even greater?
So in 2001, when I first got there, I was brought in as a consultant just to observe how the Open operated. They had built Arthur Ashe Stadium in 1997, had rebuilt Louis Armstrong in the grandstand the following year in 1998. They were just starting to scratch the surface in terms of understanding just how big of a juggernaut that the U.S. Open could be. I mean, the event had been around in New York City for almost 100 years, since I believe 1919. But they just knew that there was so much more that it could be. And it was really all about, they knew the players were taking care of what they needed to do on the court. The USTA had to figure out what we wanted to do off the court.
Okay.
A gentleman named Arlen Kintarian had been brought in a couple of years before that, and he came from the NFL with a lot of experience in showtime, as we like to call it. And he hired some professional people such as myself who had a long history in promoting events and operating venues. And so when I got in there, I was a little bit of a kid in the candy store. I had a board who said to me, hey, we want to do more things. We're just not quite sure, and we'll help you find the funding for it if you can kind of put together your list of what would be fun for our fans and for the players.
That's just too bad.
And all of our partners.
Right.
And so it was the perfect opportunity for me. So when I got there August 1st of 2001, and I had basically the next 6 weeks to evaluate how they kind of ramped up for the Open, and then how the Open actually operated. I had gone to the U.S. Open for 20 years as a fan before that, but really wasn't observing it from a USTA perspective.
Right.
And then shortly, literally, the event closed on September 9th, and September 11th, 2001 was the day when the world kind of changed drastically, certainly in New York City. So I was right there at the epicenter of breaking down the U.S. Open at that time, and starting to say, I'm only here for 6 weeks, and I can tell you that when 2002 comes around, when the U.S. Open takes place, it's going to be a whole different experience. And yes, it was.
Now, and the thing that I don't think that we understand as fans, we see the U.S. Open. That's a few weeks out of the year. What else do you do with the facility, and what can you do? Obviously, well, we'll get to that later, but what else can you do with the facility during the rest of the year?
So, I mean, it's two things. We jokingly say that the day the Open ends, we're already behind schedule for next year's Open. Because if
Right.
you come out to the Open, you realize it's never the same thing year after year. It's always, we have to introduce that wow factor. So many of our fans are repeat guests. We got to make sure their experience for the following year is even more special than the year before. Our customer survey results are off the chart, 95+% satisfaction. That's kind of unheard of in sports and entertainment. But we don't just sit there and say, patting ourselves on the back, say we did a great job, let's just do the same thing next year. So half the team spends their whole year on what's next and then implementing what's next. Well, it didn't work as well as we wanted. And then we're a public tennis facility. So we've got a team of 25 to 30 people who run the tennis programs at the National Tennis Center 11 months a year outside of that U.S. Open period. We're open from 6 a.m. to midnight. We host over 70 high schools and colleges that play all their matches there and practices there. And then we run programs from toddlers to seniors and everything in between every single day of the year outside of the U.S. Open period.
And I like it, and people wouldn't understand that it is a public facility.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
The USTA, when it moved from Forest Hills, it was at a private club
Right.
that was operated independently of the U.S. Open. And the big thing Slew Hester, who was the president of the organization back then, said is that we want to take it to the masses. We want to make sure it's open to the public. So we get to do both here. We get to operate a public tennis facility 11 months a year. And then we host that qualifying tournament as part of that 3-week U.S. Open period. And that's free to the public. And then we get into the main draw where we're selling tickets for 2 weeks, which funds the mission for the rest of the year.
So if a knucklehead like myself, who's a tennis junkie, says, I'm going to take my brother to go play on the courts, how do I arrange that? Or can I arrange that?
Well, the good news, bad news is the great news for us is that our programs are packed 11 months of the year from 6 a.m. to midnight. Doesn't mean you can't participate in them, but you don't just pull up to our parking lot B at the National Tennis Center and I want to book a court for an hour, chances are the courts are going to be full. And ironically, because of all the high schools and colleges, come March, even if there's snow on the ground, you'll see college kids out there shoveling the outdoor courts. They got to practice. They got matches coming up.
Right.
So, you could sign up for our programs anytime. There are off hours, what we call the shoulder hours in the tennis business, where you might be able to just get a court. And we even rent out Arthur Ashe Stadium. So the experience isn't just about, bottom line is people who are playing on our outdoor courts are playing on the same courts that people participating in the U.S. Open are playing on.
Wow, that's impressive. That's something I never would have thought of. That's pretty cool. Okay, so let's get into it because it's the monkey on the shoulder here. What are we doing right now, either to prepare for the Open or actually going through the pandemic right now? What's happening at the facility?
So we're working on multiple fronts, as you can imagine. I mean, obviously across the country, there's not a lot of tennis being played, but some states are opening up, and the USTA is the governing body, wants to make sure that people are playing responsibly and they're going by the accordance of what the CDC is saying is the appropriate and healthy way to be playing tennis. We don't have that luxury in New York City right now, being at the epicenter of the epicenter, and Queens has really been the hardest hit of the 5 boroughs. We got a phone call from the governor's office about 5 or 6 weeks ago, saying that they were looking for anywhere from 1 million to 2 million square feet of open space for incremental hospital beds, because the hospitals were overrun at the time. We didn't have anywhere near 1 million, but we have a 12-court indoor building, which would offer them upwards of 100,000 square feet. And so working with the Office of Emergency Management in the city and the Parks Department as our landlord, they did a walkthrough of our indoor tennis center, and they said, you know what, this will be perfect. We're only 3.5 miles from the Elmhurst Hospital, which has really been hit the hardest in the whole city. And within 7 to 10 days, they were up and running. They opened up, their intention was a 350-bed hospital facility. They got the first 150 beds open within 7 to 10 days, and then they built out the rest. So they got 450 beds at the time. They had capacity for 22 ICU patients.
Wow.
And the good news is that by the time they were up and running, since this was all precautionary, they kind of hit the peak in the epidemic, and thankfully it's been subsiding substantially. So they haven't seen anywhere near the volume of what they could have hit in terms of patients at the tennis center. They didn't need the ICU beds, which was comforting as well.
Good.
There are still patients there. We're hoping probably by the end, by about May 15th or so, that maybe all the patients might be released. And then they'll spend the next 2 or 3 weeks after that decommissioning the space and getting it ready for when the governor might tell us we might be able to open back up for business again. At the same time, our one of our food concessionaires, Restaurant Associates, reached out to us. They do a tremendous amount of work in New York City. And they said the city was looking for companies such as them to create about 25,000 box meals a day for underprivileged school kids and for the first responders. And so right around that same time, about a month ago, they took over Louis Armstrong Stadium, where we have another food commissary, and they took over the actual court itself, and they laid out tables, and they brought in this prepackaged food, and they started boxing up 6 meals in each box, 2 days worth of meals. And that went on for several weeks. It's kind of subsided now. They're doing hot meal prep now for the first responders. And my guess is that'll start to subside much more in the weeks ahead as well. So by no means are we out of the woods completely in New York City, but things are looking more encouraging.
And I think what we don't see in other parts of the country is how much New York pulls together when something like this happens.
There's no question. There's no question about it. That's what the city's all about. You know, you jokingly say when it's around Christmas time, everybody's best friend when you're walking down the streets of New York City.
Right.
So it takes the holidays, and it takes some catastrophes and other significant things. Obviously, the Yankees or Mets or somebody wins the World Series, everybody's a New Yorker. But and then really getting back to your question, as it relates to the U.S. Open itself, you go back to February, and we said at that time, the Open's still 6 months away. Let's continue with our planning. And then as you kind of realize that things are so fluid with this whole process, each and every day, time is getting away from us. It then becomes March, and then it becomes April. And throughout that 60-day period, we were looking at every single contingency plan under the sun. What would happen if there was no U.S. Open? What are the different variables we could look at in terms of a hybrid type of approach? And we continue that evaluation each and every day. There's a whole team that works on this. We have a medical community, a task force that gives us incredible guidance in terms of what we can expect in the marketplace. So nothing's been ruled out. The Open is not canceled by any means. We cannot guarantee today that we play in front of a 100% packed crowd, but we're evaluating everything.
in a perfect world, how long does it take from point A to the first day?
Well, point A should have begun months ago.
Right.
Listen, you spend the whole off season and those winter months preparing for it and doing work indoors. We're actually building a new broadcast compound this year for our international broadcast partners. We broadcast to over 200 countries. It's very difficult to host the event if you don't have your broadcast building. It's usually done with temporary trailers. The location of those temporary trailers is now a building. The building's not done yet, but we have been considered to be in a position where we actually can bring a workforce back to work on that building and get it completed in time for the Open. So it'll be a race to the finish, but we'll get it done. There's many things that we'd be doing on the grounds come April 1 that we haven't been able to do. And so with each month that passes by that we can't do that work, we have to reevaluate, can you take the April and May, that lost time, and cram it into June, July, and August? And when we get to something that the answer is no, then we'll just figure out how to do that at the Open if we're hopefully fortunate enough to host the event.
Okay, now taking all that out of play, and let's get to what we see more years than this one. What does it take to get people from this court to that court to that court to someplace to stay? I mean, what is the operations of putting on just for the players themselves? How much does that take?
I would say that if the U.S. Open was a one-day event, you can consider it to be manageable. But considering that we do this event for 21 days in a row, it's like that typical restaurant in Good Times on Mother's Day that they wish they had Mother's Day business every day. The U.S. Open experience is like hosting 21 Super Bowls in a row. It just keeps coming, and we love that. The team that works on the Open lives for it every single year. It doesn't drag its feet, and it relishes the opportunity to do that. And the whole team, most of which are working from home right now, wishes they were at the tennis center in that drive right now to get us to that point where we can start welcoming 800,000 plus people. I wouldn't say it's not a logistical nightmare. It's all about the logistics. It's
Right.
an incredible plan. It's everything from our director of operations to the person who heads the front of house service that interacts with the public. It's the training we do at Disney on an annual basis. It's our head of security who has to interact with all the city, state, and federal agencies. It's myself kind of helping manage that whole process and putting out fires as they go on. And to know that come the first day of Fan Week, that qualifying tournament, that once we open to the public, that we put the best plan together, and that we're basically at that point in time, we're not still trying to behind the scenes make things work.
Right.
We've had to set it up so that it works perfectly come day one, and then you're just tweaking for the next 20 days after that.
How many people roughly are involved in that process?
Well, it's a pretty lean and mean team that kind of puts all the plans together throughout the year. But, we have a whole team of people that just hires the seasonal workforce. And our seasonal workforce is made up of over 7,000 people that work the event. So that's everything from security officers to food and beverage people to merchandise sellers and everything else, cleaners and drivers that are transporting the players from hotels and houses to the tennis center and everything else in between.
And you've got ball boys and coaches and people. I mean, security has to be right on the money because you have people coming and going all the time.
Exactly right. And there's just no room for error with that stuff. And by no means are we perfect, but we also have to make sure that, listen, we're an international sporting event. The world is its eyes are on the US Open for those 3 weeks. So whether you're on TV or whether you're the fan there, you want to feel incredibly safe and secure. But at the same time, you want people to have that experience and not feel like they're confined in what they're doing.
Now, any preliminary talks as far as spacing and distancing, or is that, again, we're looking down the road for that?
So it's certainly part of those preliminary conversations. You have to look at it. We don't really like anything about that. It doesn't sound like it's the U.S. Open.
Right.
But it has to be evaluated so that we'd be sticking our head in the sand if we weren't looking at everything.
And would it be something like every other seat or fewer?
We just don't know. I mean, the unique thing about the U.S. Open, it's like the Olympics and the fact that there's multiple sporting events going on at the same time. In our case, it's multiple matches going on at the same time. So when someone says to me during a very successful U.S. Open, why was it so crowded at that one point in time? I was like, well, a match ended in Arthur Ashe Stadium at the same time it ended at Louis Armstrong Stadium. Right. If the people want to leave the stadium, there's not much you could do about it because you can't time that stuff. So part of that is the grounds passes that we sell, in addition to the reserve seats that we sell in Ashe and Armstrong. So the evaluation will include, maybe we'll have to cut back on the number of grounds passes that we sell, just cutting back on the exposure in terms of the volume of people that might be in certain locations. The great news for us is in 2018, we finished a $650 million transformation of the entire site. And one of the biggest initiatives of that transformation was to create more open space on the site. So those big crowd mob scenes that people saw on the site historically is, I don't want to say it's a thing of the past, but it certainly doesn't happen with the frequency it used to.
So there's more room to get in and out and more traffic flow.
And just more capacity. Armstrong Stadium had been 10,000. It's now 14,000. The old grandstand was 6,000 seats. The new one is 8,200. So in different places, and grandstand used to be right next door to Armstrong. Now it's on the complete opposite end of the site. Right. So we're spreading the experience out and creating more open space within each location.
Okay, now in your mind, in the 20 years, let's take, you said you went 20 years before that as a fan. Are you able to, first of all, are you able to experience it as a fan still? Or is it, I have so many things going on, I can't watch this, I can't watch that, and it doesn't really sink in?
Well, I don't experience it as a fan, as someone who sits in a seat and watches matches at a time, because it's important for us to evaluate how things are going across all 40 acres throughout the 21 days of the tournament, just to make sure that the things that we implemented are working. And if they're not, what do we need to change either then in real time or for the following year? So I'm observing it as a fan the entire tournament because I want to look at it through the fan's eyes. I've just not experienced it. I'm not having the joy of the fan would be having sitting in a seat watching a match.
Okay, so in the adjustments we've made over the last 20 years, what is the not the biggest thing, but the best thing that you said? You said every year you try something different. What's the best thing that you guys have done? Or one of the
well, listen, the list is lengthy. There's no question. For years, I always used to say the two things we can't control are who wins the matches and the weather. And by being able to, we started the first roof study on Arthur Ashe Stadium in 2003, and we did 4 more incremental subsequent roof studies after that time. And it wasn't until 2011 where we actually came up with a solution. But before 2011, we had 5 years in a row where rain impacted the ability to host the men's finals on a Sunday. Right. So 5 years in a row we played on a Monday. So there's no question from a fan's perspective, and fans come from all over the world to attend the US Open. More than 40% of the fans come from outside the tri-state area. More than 15% are international. They're coming out for a day, a week, the whole tournament. And for them to come out for that special bucket list item and then for it to rain that day was nothing we ever felt good about. Even if they ended up spending the entire day at the tennis center, just hanging out and having a phenomenal time, they didn't get to watch tennis, and clearly it was the #1 priority. Right. Now we have a retractable roof over the largest tennis stadium in the world, and then we're able to build Armstrong. So now we have 2 stadiums, so we can play matches in pairs, even if the rest of the field gets rained out that particular day. So that has to be the biggest achievement at the US Open over those 20 years. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we introduced night tennis. We introduced the blue courts that really kind of changed the look of tennis across the entire United States. Instituted instant replay on all our field courts, on all the tournament courts. So those 2 big roofs were certainly a big thing, but it wasn't everything. The women's finals in prime time on Saturday night for many years, now played Saturday afternoon. These have all been incredible initiatives for the USTA.
When we look at the grand landscape of everything, tennis-wise, are we in consideration with Wimbledon, with the Australian, with Roland Garros, or is it kind of we operate separately of them but together of them at the same time?
Well, there's a great camaraderie between the 4 Grand Slam tournaments, but at the end of the day, they're representing their countries in their own unique way. So, that you leave that to the fans and the media and others to say what's their favorite Grand Slam or what makes one the best versus the other. But I think they're all phenomenal in their own right. They all have their own uniqueness, and we're a New York City event, so that makes it so unique in its own right. Right. And that's what makes us different from the other 3 Grand Slams.
Okay, so now as we're preparing for all of these fun little things, you said you have to go to the facility now. What's in store, best case scenario for the next few months?
Well, we know that the Governor Cuomo in New York State, that he's basically told people their stay-at-home order is still in effect through the beginning of June. That allows us to get some essential work done at the same time that will wind down the food service operation for the first responders, wind down the hospital operation. As those operations wind down, we will start to get in the business of prepping for the US Open. And by the way, we run incredibly large and successful summer camps. as part of our tennis programs out at the tennis center, and they would be beginning as soon as the public schools would usually close. We would hope that we'd be in a position to host kids out here for our camps at some point over the summer, just because people need to get out.
Right.
So if the city's in a better position, we want to be able to do that. So it's not just all about the U.S. Open, but certainly that's a big part of our mission and what we're trying to do here. So the goal will be until we get to that June period when hopefully the governor will release the stay at home. We're going to spend the rest of May understanding the extent of what we haven't been able to get done and how we make up for that lost time come June, July, and August.
Well, Danny, I appreciate it. I know you've got a lot to do today. I appreciate you taking the time. I hope we haven't made it too boring for you and made it interesting to provide information that I think our audience is going to really want to learn about, and some of the behind the scenes stuff that maybe we hadn't thought about. So I appreciate your time.
Well, I appreciate spending the time with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Have a good day.
Okay.